This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. My guest on this episode is Kelsey Hanson Woodruff. Kelsey Hanson Woodruff is a recently defended PhD candidate in religion at Harvard University. On this episode, we discuss a section of her dissertation titled Outposts in the Wilderness, Post-Evangelical Feminist Communities on Digital Media, 2004 to 2024, about online community building. We highlight the work of Rachel Held Evans, Devi Abraham, Sarah Bessey, Cindy Wang Brandt, and discuss the importance of public scholarship. Her dissertation is a historical and ethnographic study of digital communities of post-evangelical feminists in the 21st century. Her research and teaching interests include evangelicalism and post-evangelicalism, religion and gender, and religion and American politics. You can find her on Blue Sky at K. Hanson Woodruff. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy. Kelsey Hanson Woodruff, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted that you're here. Kelsey, I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a scholar of religion, gender, and media. I am currently finishing my PhD in religion at Harvard, and my dissertation is about post-evangelical feminist digital communities.
And you recently defended that, so congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
How long was that process for you with the writing and the research and the defense process? How did that go?
It went well, yeah. This is my 7th year in the PhD program, so about the 4th year I've been working on this dissertation, both with research and with the writing.
I want to go back a little bit and kind of hear how you got to the point that you're at today. Can you just tell me a little bit about some of your major turning points in your intellectual and academic path? Like any major moments along the way that kind of led you down this area of interest and expertise that you are now at today?
Yeah, so I went to Stanford University, which is close to where I grew up in California, and I intended to be a lawyer, so I thought I would major in political science. And my very first fall quarter of my freshman year, I took one political science class, which turned out to be a fairly advanced class in game theory, which I did not enjoy. And I also randomly signed up for an Introduction to Buddhism class, and I just fell in love with religious studies. So it started there in terms of my academic journey. And then when I was looking at going to graduate school, my undergraduate advisor, his name was Robert Gray. He passed away a couple of years ago. He was wonderful. He said that if I went to graduate school, I should find at least 2 people in my PhD program, 2 professors that I could really rely on and who were reliable people as well as good scholars. And I've been really thankful to find that at Harvard. I've had a very positive PhD experience.
Excellent. Were you always interested? Where did the post-evangelicalism and evangelicalism and research interest in like gender and stuff like that come from? How did that process develop along the way?
So I read a lot of the authors that I then ended up studying prior to graduate school. And so when I was coming up with a topic, I just felt that there has never been enough research on women in religion, and especially women leaders, because traditionally the history of Christianity has been largely denominational history. Now that's changed in the last 50 years for sure. There's a lot of good research out there now, including from my advisor, Catherine Breckes. I felt that there wasn't a lot of research on what was then, things are changing very fast, but what was then contemporary generations on digital media. So I study primarily millennial and Generation X people. And within that sphere, there's all these women leaders who are not necessarily leaders in their churches or denominations, but they're leaders online. And so I was really interested in that.
Wonderful. I want to talk a little bit about your dissertation project. I've been looking at some of it. It's called Outposts in the Wilderness, Post-Evangelical Feminist Communities on Digital Media from 2004 to 2024. And I love this range of years because 2004, I was in college as well at the University of Missouri. So it's like right when I kind of start feeling like more of an adult in the world. So your dissertation years encapsulate basically what I consider to be the core of my adult life. So I was like, yes. And I really related to the topic and to the years in general that you're discussing because it's so much of the development of social media, which has happened right in front of my eyes for the last two decades. It really is present in the work that you're doing as well. And I love the quote says, my dissertation research focuses on a network of contemporary feminist Christians who resist dominant patriarchal forms of American evangelicalism. So tell me a little bit about what your dissertation is about. Just kind of set the stage for us before we get into a little bit more specifics.
Yeah, so Outposts in the Wilderness is a part of my dissertation that I'm writing as an article. The reason I chose 2004 is just as you said, that's the year that Facebook went semi-public. It kind of expanded over the year, right? It started with certain colleges and then it expanded. It's also the year that the first author that I study a network of authors, and that's the year Sarah Bessey started her blog, and then others started them in 2006, 2007, etc. So that's really when both social media and blogging was really becoming big. And then obviously in the interim years, we've had the popularization of podcasting, different forms of social media. More recently, I've been studying Substack newsletters as a primary focus of these digital communities and how they're getting their messages out to their readers.
Yeah, I really liked the that you just mentioned podcast too. I was recently watching, I don't know if you ever watched the TV show One Tree Hill many years ago, but there's an episode from one of their 2005, 2006 seasons where it's like one of the characters starts a podcast and I was like, wow, that really is the front lines of when that media started to take off as well. And here I am making podcasts all these years later. But back to the topic, tell me a little bit about evangelical women in the world in the U.S. Just kind of like overview what listeners need to know about this demographic and population of people, and then we'll talk a little bit about leaving and finding community after that. What is the evangelical women community like in the U.S. and the world that you know off the top of your head?
Yeah, so evangelicals are approximately a fourth of the U.S. population, which is quite high. That's about how many Catholics there are as well, somewhere between 20 and 25%. So those are two of the largest religious groups in the U.S. The percentage of women in evangelicalism is slightly higher than men over all the generations. So there's about 40 million evangelical women in the United States. Now, you may have read that more recently, the population of younger women who are religious as a whole, but that includes evangelicalism, is actually less than young men. So we're talking Generation Z. But in all the other generations, in millennials and Gen X and boomers, et cetera, the population of women in most religions, including evangelicalism, is slightly higher than men.
So I would imagine that for many of them who are born into it, over the course of their life, they, learn new things about the world, and some of them decide to leave these communities, these really like tight-knit communities that they've grown up in. And I'd imagine that is a very hard experience. Tell me a little bit about the women who wind up leaving evangelical communities in the U.S.
A lot of religions are declining now. For a long time, for several decades, it looked like mainline Protestantism was declining, but evangelicalism was not. But in recent years, it has seemed that evangelicalism is also declining. Now that's leveled off a little bit. I think the most recent years' numbers, it seems that the decline of religiously affiliated people and Christianity as well has kind of leveled off. For a while there, it looked like the disaffiliated people who are not particularly religious, was going to rise indefinitely. And that's not what's happened, at least this year. But the rise of disaffiliated people in younger generations is much higher than older generations. And so in terms of the population or the group of people that I'm looking at, I call them post-evangelical feminists. They actually tend to still identify as Christian, but not to identify as evangelical anymore. I would say the largest group of those are actually leaving evangelical churches. Many of them land in mainline Protestant churches, so Methodist or Presbyterian or Episcopal. Some of them stay in moderate evangelical churches, but don't consider themselves evangelical, and they are trying to make changes in their churches. So, for instance, trying to make them more inclusive for LGBTQ youth and leaders as well. And then there's a third group that has left evangelical churches and have not found other religious communities. Many of them are still looking.
As your work points out, they leave and they tend to try to find new communities elsewhere. And something that your work does so well is it highlights the powerful online communities that are available and that people wind up finding as they leave these religious communities in search of something else, and they kind of find their like-minded people a little bit. Tell me about what tends to happen when evangelical women leave and then go searching for new communities in online spaces.
Yeah, so one of my dissertation committee members is a historian named David Hempton, and he wrote this book called Evangelical Disenchantment, which is 9 mini biographies of famous figures through history who have had really intense involvements with evangelicalism. They have been parts of evangelical communities and then have left. So this includes James Baldwin, it includes Vincent van Gogh, George Eliot, who was a female author. And they have left for varying reasons, some having to do with hypocrisy, some having to do with the same issues that my interlocutors are looking at: patriarchy, ways that women have been treated in churches. And so today, though, in at least sort of in the 21st century, in the time period that I'm looking at, people have not just left communities into no community, but they've been able to find like-minded people who have their same theological leanings, political leanings, and values that they consider to be Christian values. And they're able to find those people online. So even if they don't know a lot of people from their former churches or in their current churches that are thinking about and concerned about the same things they are, they can find people across geographic region, even across national borders. So the digital communities that I'm looking at are bounded by language, not necessarily nation, although they are fairly dominated by United States folks, because that's a lot of who is reading evangelical books, and there's just a lot of evangelicals in the US. So there are some authors and readers in Canada and in Australia and in England, but I was interviewing readers in the United States to find out, in our political context, what was their experience like. And these digital communities can be really powerful because you can be, really turned off by something that your pastor said or a Bible study leader said to you, or your family members that don't agree and have the same values as you do. And then you can go online and find people who do, or find these leaders who are authors who are writing online about the things that concern you. And so there is a sense of community when you leave. It's not exactly the same as an in-person community. There's many ways that in-person communities are important in people's lives that a digital community is not, which is why a lot of people do also look for an in-person community. But these digital communities really have an important function.
So tell me a little bit about your experience inside these communities as the researcher. I'm curious about where you are working, where you are reading, how you're interacting with any of the other people in these communities. Tell me about your role inside those communities themselves and where they are.
Yeah, so I did both digital and in-person field work. The communities were largely on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And so I follow lots of authors. I'm part of private groups. I attended digital Bible studies. I went to digital book events. Those were especially prevalent during the pandemic, which is part of when I did my research. So I started my research in depth in 2021. And I had thought that most of my research would be in person, but actually it kind of worked out in terms of the kind of research that I do, that there were so many events online. And I ended up doing a lot of my interviews with readers online as well, which helped because then I could interview readers that were in rural places that I might not have traveled to. So I did do some travel. I traveled to conferences too. So some of these authors that have primarily digital communities also put on conferences or speak at retreats and events. So I went to a few of those. I went on a pilgrimage. And so I also met people in person, but I did a lot of digital field work as well. And just like my interlocutors who are readers, who are following these folks, I was doing field work at home. I was doing field work at my desk at work. I was reading things or listening to podcasts on the train or in my car or, on my runs. And so I think that's how we all consume media these days, is in every place we go.
Yeah, it feels endless for me personally. I feel like I'm always in the process of consuming something almost at any given time of the day. It's pretty intense.
Right.
I do want to give you the chance to talk a little bit about Rachel Held Evans, who was featured in the piece that I read. She passed away in 2019, but I know you're also doing a biography on her. But this essay opens with Rachel Held Evans, and I'm just curious if you wanted to talk about her a little bit and her importance and role in your work.
Yeah, so Rachel Held Evans is a 21st century author. She started as a blogger. She published 4 books during her lifetime. One has been published posthumously. And she really was a node in this network of women authors that I am writing about. So not only was she sort of one of those initial people on sort of the forefront of creating a blog that had many readers, but she also used her blog and her platform to promote other women authors. And so she intentionally became this networker. So readers would come to her blog and they would be introduced to all sorts of different authors that they could also follow their blogs or follow their social media or pick up their new book or something like that. And Rachel Held Evans was born in 1981 and she passed away at the age of 37 in 2019. And so I'm writing a biography of her and as a separate second project. And the biography has her life at the forefront. So the events of her life, how she grew up in conservative evangelicalism in the 20th century. So along the way, I get to tell all these really interesting micro histories of evangelicalism in that time period. The 1990s were really a heyday of the evangelical subculture. So, the things that she listened to, contemporary Christian music, and the things that she read, a lot of like purity culture things, and the kind of events that she attended in her youth group. So I get to tell a lot of the 20th century history, the last 19 years of the 20th century. And then in the 21st century, she was a part of Christian history during that time period. So I write about, again, the way that she was this node in this network of authors, the work that she produced, and through other people's blogs, through news articles that I found, and through the interviews that I did for my dissertation work, I know a lot about her impact on readers in the 21st century, especially readers who were having these contentions with conservative evangelicalism, but who wanted to retain their faith. And she helped a lot of people to do that. She helped women who felt that they were called to ministry, for instance, but they had grown up in a denomination that didn't allow women in ministry. But she, writing about maybe God does allow for women leaders, helped people to see themselves as leaders. Same thing for a lot of LGBTQ Christians who thought that they didn't fit in their conservative evangelical churches, but they wanted to retain their Christian faith. And her writing out loud in public and saying, I actually think that God loves all people, including LGBTQ people, also helped them to include themselves. So even though she herself was a middle-class, white, cisgender, straight woman married to a man, she helped to widen the door for a lot of people who wanted to stay Christian, but didn't want to experience an exclusive Christian faith.
And that's amazing too, because the years of her life directly correspond with the rise of internet and digital cultures and communities as well. So it's like this perfect timeline and this like time period to highlight the amazing work that she did while also tracking the rise of like online and digital communities. I'm really excited to read that. I hope that when that book comes out, you'll come back on the podcast and talk about it again, because that sounds like an absolutely wonderful project.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Is there anything else that you want to like preview for the dissertation, or turning it into an academic monograph for listeners out there to get psyched about this project?
Yeah, so I'm in the process of turning it into a monograph. But the title of my dissertation was Faithful Descent, so that may be the title of the book. That is sort of its prospective title. So I'm looking at university presses to propose that to right now. So hopefully within the next couple of years, that will be a book that will be available to the public at a university press. And then the biography is coming out with Erdman's Publishing. So that one will be widely available as well. They have a really wonderful historical biography series that has all sorts of important leaders, not only Christian leaders. It started with Christian leaders. So there's the George Whitfields and folks, but there's been some really interesting biographies as well of other religious leaders. Someone did Tina Turner recently, and she had a Baptist background, but also was a Buddhist later in her life. One of my favorites is of Ruth Bell Graham, Billy Graham's wife, written by a historian named Anne Blue Wills, and that's really beautifully done as well. So they're starting to get a lot more women figures, and so they were excited about Rachel Held Evans, and I'm excited to write for them.
Wonderful. Well, I've featured several Erdman's publications on the podcast over the last 7 or 8 years, so I will definitely have to be on the lookout for those. I read one more thing. So I know we've mostly focused on American context. I know that you've written something else recently called Christian Feminists from Abroad Confront U.S. Sexual Politics, which came out from Harvard University's Epicenter, where you highlight the works of Sarah Bessey from Canada, Devi Abraham from Australia, and Cindy Wang Brandt from Taiwan. I'm wondering if you just want to talk a little bit about the international aspect of your work as well, that you highlighted so beautifully in this piece about these 3 other women who are doing this great work in the world.
Yeah, as I said, the communities that I study are international. So people who are writing and speaking in English are able to speak to people across national borders. And these 3 women in particular, I found really interesting. Sarah Bessey was a good friend of Rachel Held Evans, and so they interacted quite a bit. But both Bessey and Brandt and Abraham, they all have had interactions with U.S. evangelicalism. So many of them went to school here, to evangelical colleges within the U.S. or spent some part of their childhood here. And so they knew U.S. evangelicalism really well. As I said about 1990s evangelical subculture, the U.S. has created all of these evangelical institutions that has spread their media everywhere in the world. So they've sent books and they've sent tapes and podcasts now and things like that. And part of what gets exported is the political side of U.S. evangelicalism. So U.S. evangelicalism has been particularly Republican since 1980. Prior to that, it was very mixed in terms of political coalitions. And since 1980, it has been dominantly Republican since the election of Ronald Reagan, which we call that the religious right. And the religious right includes a lot of evangelicals. It also includes conservative Catholics and other folks. But the political part of U.S. evangelicalism has been exported along with purity culture and other elements of U.S. evangelicalism that are really particular to U.S. culture. And I found it really interesting that authors in other countries are speaking back to that and saying, you know what, I actually don't agree with this part of what has been exported. So I'm still a Christian and I have appreciated elements of evangelicalism and I still agree with some of them, but I reject this part. And so that includes, Sarah Bessey has spoken actually really recently as a Canadian about the things that Trump has been saying about Canada. And Abraham, talks about purity culture and said, actually this material that came to us all over the world is actually really harmful. And purity culture is a patriarchal understanding that relies on gender hierarchy, so men as leaders and women as submissive followers. And it puts all this pressure on especially women to have certain sexual behavior. And so she and her fellow podcaster have looked at, what would it look like to have an idea of Christianity which includes marriage and faithfulness and whatnot, but that rejects this kind of purity culture that came out of the United States.
Yeah, well, I've also been looking up Abraham's podcast a little bit. Where do we go from here? I also love that Sarah Mosliner got mentioned a little bit in the piece. She's been on the podcast before. And then Cinda Wang Brandt also has a podcast called Parenting Forward. So a lot of great resources if listeners out there want to check out Christian Feminists from Abroad Confront U.S. Sexual Politics from Harvard University's Epicenter. You highlighted what they're doing so nicely, and it's so nice for me to learn things that people around the world are doing as well, especially with the highly volatile nature of United States politics at the moment. Seeing how people abroad are reacting to what is happening here, it means a lot. So thank you for highlighting the work that they're doing as well. So let's chat a little bit about public scholarship in general. You are a Sacred Rights Carpenter cohort member for 2025, and I just want to hear a little bit about your experience of doing the public scholarship trainings and why you think it matters for yourself to be a public-facing scholar as you get ready to commence into the world as a new doctoral graduate.
So I've always felt that public scholarship was really important. It's part of what I would like to do. It's part of what I want to do with my scholarship. I think it's important to not only translate, but also disseminate good research that is happening. One of the reasons for this is especially with my work, so I'm looking at progressive post-evangelicals. I first started calling them evangelicals and then realized they did not identify as evangelicals at all. And so I use the word post-evangelical to both connect them to evangelicalism because they are historically and theologically connected, but also to disconnect them and to respect the fact that they disidentify that way. And in fact, they are very different from the dominant conservative evangelicalism. I say dominant rather than hegemonic because it has always been contested. Things like patriarchy have always been contested within evangelicalism. So there have always been progressive evangelicals, but I think it's important to show the internal diversity of religions and religious traditions. So a lot of people, you say the word progressive evangelical to them and they say, isn't that paradoxical? Well, it's actually not. And, historically it's not. And there has always been quite a bit of diversity on the way people have looked at gender and what it means to be a Christian woman or a Christian man. And so I think good research on the diversity of religions should get out there into the world. And also people are interested in it. I mean, in this particular political moment, I think it's fairly obvious how religions affect politics. And so I think that's also important. There's often a dearth of public knowledge about how religions work or religious institutions or how religious people think. And so I think that's important to get that out there. And also scholars can help the media to be more accurate, more precise, more nuanced, more well-rounded about how they're reporting on things. Now, there are a lot of wonderful religious reporters that really know what they're talking about. And I read them and I have talked to some of them. So I don't want to say that there's not, but I think that scholars themselves, people who have done PhDs, people who are currently doing research can help with that.
Excellent. Well, in the trainings, I know that one of the major things that you all focus on are the risks, rewards, and responsibilities of being a publicly facing scholar. This is a very interesting time in American history. Tell me how you see the risks, rewards, and responsibilities for focusing on the topics that you do at this time that we're living through.
One of the risks as a younger scholar who's still looking for a job at a university in which I can do research and teaching is just that public scholarship is not always valued as sort of real scholarship. For me, I think of it as an extension of my scholarship. So I want to write for the public and write for the academy. I want to do both at the same time. So I'm hoping that that will be valued. I think it's becoming more valued over time as more people do it, and just as we see, the effects of not getting that research out there as well. So, but it is a little bit it's a little bit risky as a younger or contingent scholar who's still looking for a permanent position in the academy.
Yeah. I would like to think that if I was on a tenure and promotion committee and seeing the trends in the world, that I would want to be rewarding of people on my faculty who were publicly facing. I would like to think that if I was in charge of a university, that is how I would that's how I would roll. But traditions and norms can be hard to bust out of sometimes. So I appreciate that you're trying to do both at once. It sounds very difficult, but also awesome, because you put out the book with Erdman's, like, you're going to get so many more readers on something like that than you would in a journal behind a paywall. So I love that you're trying to be doing both at the same time. Any other favorite takeaways from the sacred rights training that you that really stand out to you?
Yeah, for me, being a part of a cohort is the best part of that training, in the sense that I can be inspired by my colleagues, by the leaders who are leading it, the material, but also by my fellow cohort members who are figuring out how to be public scholars as well.
Awesome. Well, Kelsey Hanson Woodruff, where can people find you if they want to follow along with the work that you are doing now and in the future?
Yeah, so I have a website, kelseyhansonwoodruff.com, and I'm also on Blue Sky, so at khansonwoodruff.bluesky.
Wonderful. I will put the links for those in the show notes so people can just open up the show notes in this podcast episode and go directly to those. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that we're able to connect again in the future. Whenever you do the Rachel Held Evans book, when that comes out, please know that you're invited to come back and join me for another conversation to talk in more depth about that project. But thank you so much for being here, Kelsey Hanson Woodruff. It's been a real pleasure today.
Thank you very much.